Once you have selected your evidence and you're ready to include it in an evidence response, there's one extra step that you need to take, and that's finding a way to transition it into your evidence response. One thing I've noticed a lot of us doing is that we just put the evidence right in, and it's kind of like you're just doing the parts of the organizer instead of linking all your ideas together into a complete paragraph. But you need to remember that an evidence response is a complete paragraph. It's ideas that transition from one to the next. You're trying to prove a point. You're including evidence to back up your point. You're providing context to lead into that evidence. You're analyzing the evidence to explain how it proves the claim. And you're leaving your reader with a conclusion, something to think about. The evidence is the key part of this, but in order to really include the evidence and link it in, you have to include some sort of transition before you include it. So when you're including a transition, you want to make sure you also use the proper punctuation. Most often, when you use a transition, it's going to be followed by a comma, and then you'll provide the evidence because you're using this introductory phrase to lead into the quotation. So you want to use a comma. That's one of the rules of how to use a comma into the quote. So I gave you some examples here of different types of transitions you might use as you are including evidence. So some transitions can be basic, something that says, for instance, for example, or the text states. That's just a basic transition that you can use so you're at least leading into the evidence. You want to make sure before this in your context you have enough information that's going to set up the evidence, but at least to transition in, you could use something like this. And you can see here, the comma goes right here, and then I have a space, and I go right into my quotation marks for my evidence. We've already gone over how to cite the evidence. A different type of transition, one that is a lot stronger, and as you get more used to including evidence is even better to use, is one that embeds the evidence in a sentence. So for example, I start my transition when the author writes, and I have my comma. But then I go into my evidence. He growled in the back of his throat like a beast of prey, angry and frustrated. You'll notice, instead of making that the end of my sentence, I put a comma, and I wrote, it shows that Jack is very foreboding. So you can see right here that I have used my evidence almost as an interruption. So I could put when the author writes, and then I have my evidence, it shows that Jack is very foreboding. It all connects as one complete idea, and I'm really embedding the evidence to show the reader exactly what I'm trying to prove with this evidence. So it's almost like I've combined my return to claim and my evidence in one complete line. So you can see how I punctuate that with the commas before and within my evidence, and then have an explanation right after. Especially if you're using some evidence that is brief, like the one I have here, and right to the point, that is something that you might want to try. If I had really lengthy evidence, it wouldn't really make sense to include it as one sentence and have a transition before and an explanation after, because if my evidence is too lengthy, it wouldn't really fit as a complete sentence. But when I have short and concise evidence like this, it fits really nicely into the sentence. So that's one way you could transition and embed the evidence in what you're trying to say. Another example of a transition is when you try to get even more specific to really show and lead into the evidence and show the reader what you're trying to get across. So here I put the author's name. Gaiman shows how frightening Jack is when he writes, and I go right into the evidence. Again, I have my comma right before, but it's almost like I'm setting up the reader to know exactly what I want them to get out of the evidence. It's specific and to the point, and it transitions nicely into what I'm trying to say. So all three of these show examples of how you can transition into evidence, and as you get more comfortable, how you can push yourself to use more advanced transitions. Regardless, you always want to include some sort of transition to lead into the evidence.